do what it's supposed to do, the second video of the day. Anyway, so I want to talk about the beginnings of the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement, it's a reaction to the war. It's a reaction to the arguments against the war. It's not really an organized movement to begin with, but what happens is a lot of the things we're going to see with the anti-war movement and things like that, and a lot of the other protest movement of the late 60s and into the 70s, they draw inspiration from the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement, with their mass protests, with their marches, with their nonviolent protests, it really inspires a lot of other different groups to try to copy what they're doing, in an attempt to get their point across as well. So what really comes about is in the beginnings of this, it starts with something called the teach-in movement. College kids who will skip their college classes and go sit down somewhere and just talk to each other about the war, about issues and efforts, and exchange ideas, right? This is the kind of the beginnings of this organized movement. Why are these people against the war? Well, the thing is, there's a lot of arguments against the war, and here they are. First of all, this is a civil war. This is South Vietnamese rebels trying to overthrow, trying to overthrow a government that sucks, right? The South Vietnamese government is repressive. It is violent against its people. It is corrupt, and it's a bad government. They want to get rid of it. And who are we in the United States to try to stop somebody from overthrowing a government that's not good? I mean, we did that in 1776, or that was our opinion, right? So that's the first argument. It's a civil war. The Vietnamese should decide this, right? We should get out of it, right? And it's morally wrong for us to support a bad government, and it's morally wrong for us to fight against a group of people who are trying to get rid of a morally wrong government, right? And so there's also other moral arguments against it. It's about who goes to Vietnam. If you're in college, chances are you could get a deferment. People who go to college are more wealthy. It is a vast, well, I'll get to that in just a minute. So it starts with the teach-in movement, all right? And the moral arguments against against this war. People really focus their energies against the draft. They are against the draft. So most of the protesters, you can understand, are draft age, right? People who would have to go to Vietnam to fight. My own dad graduated from high school in 65. He served in the Coast Guard, right? He didn't protest against the war, but he certainly didn't want to go carry a rifle in Vietnam. And so he kind of enters the Coast Guard right before the real big uptick in incident troops overseas, right? So, and that's not uncommon for a lot of people to try to avoid going and carrying a rifle in the jungle of Vietnam. Plenty of people went, volunteered, and did it themselves, right? Others got drafted and sent. The idea is, if you were middle class or upper class, if you were a college student, you could get a deferment and not have to go into the military. Well, that's the wealthy, right? That's disproportionately white. That's disproportionately wealthier people who are going to be able to get out of Vietnam, right? So it's people who are poor. It's more people of color who are winding up going to Vietnam, right? It's basically a poor man's war. These are the ones that could get drafted. Let me give you an example of the disparity in numbers here. 1967, all right? In 1967, 20% of the people who are killed in Vietnam are African American. 20% of Americans killed in Vietnam are African American, right? But in 1967, only 10% of the American population is African American. So you would expect, 10% of the people getting, if it was fair, the draft was fair, 10% of the population would be 10% of the people killed in Vietnam would be African American. It would reflect the percentages closer than it does. the percentage of people killed in Vietnam would reflect the percentages of the what am I trying to say, of the population, right? It's not because black people can't dodge bullets or they make dumb mistakes or whatever. It's because there's more African Americans. There's a higher percentage of African Americans in Vietnam than there are African Americans in the population. It's disproportionate, right? It's unfair. So that's kind of the arguments against that, right? Some people will avoid the draft by going to Canada. Others would just refuse and go to jail. So people try to avoid going. We'll listen to, if we have time, something called Alice's Restaurant, which talks about, all different ways that you can try to avoid the draft or whatever. It's kind of a joke about that. Anyway, we'll get there. All right. So one of the early groups that starts kind of organizing is the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS. They have strong ties to the civil rights movement. They're a part of the what's called this youth movement. The idea behind the youth movement is that young people can't trust adults, right? Young people don't trust adults, and they support lots of causes. They're anti-poverty, they're anti-war, they're pro-civil rights, they're anti-big business. So they support a lot of different issues, and these are young, 20-something, usually educated college students, right? Here they are in front of Columbia University supporting a strike at Columbia University, which was a big deal at the time. So you've got all these radicals, they call them campus radicals, but all these people who have more left-leaning politics, who, by the way, are in politics, phasing out of it. This is Bernie Sanders was involved with the SDS when he was in his 20s. You can't say the Clintons were, because they were really on a different track, but they're the right age. They were kind of on the periphery of it. Other liberal in the 70s, and then their 70s would be about would be these guys. Anyway, so many of Tom Hayden and different other people who've been serving as politicians that have stepped aside or retired or passed away or whatever. All right. They want to radically change American society. Right. And they come up with something called the Port Huron Statement, which wants to have an end to voter apathy, an end to letting government being run by the government, by big business. They want more people involved. And this is an idea of something called the New Left. Right. This core of people who are advocating for a lot of different causes. Right. Like I said, civil rights, anti-poverty, anti-war. Right. And they're Democrats and within the Democratic Party, but they're anti-Johnson because Johnson's fighting the war. Right. So anyway, pictures of that. The SDS itself is very heavily focused on the war. Right. They have demonstrations in Washington. They do things like, I think this is the demonstration when they surround the Pentagon and try to levitate it with their good vibes. Yeah. All stuff like that. As a protest or whatever. Anyway, so all kind of different protests like that going on among the New Left. Next lecture, we're going to talk about the year 1968, which feels a little bit more personal after 2020 and early 2021. What we've gone through, very similar kind of year. Anyway, more on that later.